Gen Z, Generation Z, have been accused of killing grammar as they use less punctuation and more slang. According to a report, young people also find capital letters intimidating. Joining me now to decide if Gen Z have indeed slain grammar are Jess, Gill, who is of Gen Z and a political content creator, and Patrick Timms, who is a millennial like me and a freelance translator. Thanks very much for coming. And Sophia Warringer is also with us from the Centre for Social Justice. I think you're just clinging on to the upper echelon of Gen Z.
Something
Sophia,
like that. Trying not to be, but yeah.
Okay, so you're on the cusp, so maybe you'll give us a different perspective. And maybe I can start with you, Jess. Are you intimidated by capital letters?
I think intimidated is the wrong word. I just don't see a use for them on something like Twitter or when I'm talking to friends. I think a lot of Zoomers are very capable of using capital letters. I think we are still literate. I just think in a space like Twitter or TikTok, for example, it's not really necessary. You're just talking between friends. And something as formal as capital letters, I don't think it's really needed. You don't think it's needed, perhaps? We've seen a lot of people who are appeal to your generation. Sorry, I sound about 105 when I say that. Olivia Rodrigo, who's apparently a singer, used lowercase letters for her albums in 2021 and 2023. Ariana Grande hasn't used capital letters since 2018. But what about the purists? Maybe not purists, just people like me, I suppose, who say, well, maybe you should communicate in a way that everybody can understand. A comma is so important because it's the difference between let's eat grandma and let's eat grandma. Yeah, I think that is a valid issue, but I think most of the time I don't think it's necessarily needed. I mean, if bad grammar is the biggest thing we're accusing Zoomers of, I could accuse Boomers and your generation, Millennials, a lot more, considering what's happened to our country, the housing crisis. Zoomers, we're unable to get a house. Like, the prospects of owning a house is so unrealistic. The immigration crisis that the Boomers and other generations have consistently voted on parties that have failed to stop immigration, the cost of living, high taxation. Patrick, there are bigger issues here, as Jess says, but nonetheless, this is an issue that will niggle many, many people.
Well, I worry that we may be getting off the point here. Okay. So what I would say is, now, a lot of people could very well make a valid argument that languages change over time.
Yes.
And so they do. And so they do. So what I'm now going to do is speak in tongues a little bit. Okay?
Okay.
Okay? I'm going to read you a couple of sentences.
Go for it.
And so neither questo and weave, we forbade God you that you aton of elcom tree would be.
So what are you speaking?
Yes.
Some kind of Elvish?
Welsh?
English.
Oh, Old English.
From about 1,000 years ago.
Ah, okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
There was more to say there, but it doesn't matter. This is English from 1,000 years ago. Did you understand what I was saying?
No.
No, you did not. So
you have been insulting us.
Well, I'll tell you what I was actually doing. I was quoting from the fall of man in Genesis.
Okay.
Okay? So that's some pretty good evidence that languages change over time. Is it really fair to say that Gen Z has corrupted? No. But what it is true to say is that the way that communication has evolved, in particular the way that technologies that we use have evolved, has meant that there is less of a need to put an effort in. You know, with things like capital letters or full stops. The reason I was quoting from the Old English is so while that language had a lot more in terms of inflection and case and gender, nouns, masculine, feminine, neuter, very Germanic, what it didn't have was much in the way of punctuation, for example. I don't think the semicolon came along for a while. Okay? Yes. So it's a way of saying, look, yes, things change. The question has to be, how do things change? And really, why have they changed? Have they changed for a good reason? Is there such a thing as a distinction between a good reason and a bad reason? And if there is, then what is it? And that seems to be the nature of this debate. If people are just saying, look, I can't be bothered to use grammar because I just can't be bothered, that's not a good reason for me, because grammar for me is about structure and order and conveying meaning.
And that's a very good point, Jess, isn't it? Because if you submit a job application, for example, the chances are that the person reading that job application is not going to be in Gen Z. They're going to be older, probably in HR or a manager or something, and they're going to want the proper grammar and spelling and so on to be used. Now, obviously, you're saying that Gen Z can use spelling and grammar and all the rest of it. Some can, some can't, of course. But really, if you get into the habit of not using it, where do we kind of end this? Because if it's communicating with your peers, well, maybe there's nothing wrong with that. But actually, if you're trying to do that on a professional level, and people say, well, I'm communicating with professionally with someone who's the same age as me, well, I don't have to use capital letters or spelling or grammar.
Again, I think we have to give Zoomers a bit more credit. I think the way you talk to your friends is a lot different than the way you talk to your parents, for example. I think it's very possible to make the distinction with our language, with our grammar, of who we're talking to. We're still taught in school, from what I know, how to use spelling, punctuation and grammar. I don't think this is a real issue. I think while there is this more like laissez-faire conversation on social media between friend and friend, I think young people are still very equipped to write CVs, write professional letters, write articles. I think they're very capable of doing so. And some of the brightest minds I've seen in this generation around political discourse, for example, have come from young people. And it's not grammar that's defining it, it's ideas. So I think young people are able
to communicate those ideas, you need proper grammar, do you not?
Yeah, I completely agree, but I don't think it's the be-all, end-all. I don't think, I think these young people are capable of using proper grammar, but I'm more concerned about the ideas around it. There's great poets who I disagree with, like Benjamin Zephaniah, for example, or John Agard, and they purposefully disregard grammar, and that's a rebellion against the system. And in the same way, I don't want to give pop singers too much credit, but like Olivia Rodrigo, it's a rebellion against the system. It's defining her own narrative.
It's interesting, actually, as well, when there are so many writers now. Sally Rooney, for example, very popular Irish writer who wrote what was the name of the BBC?
Normal People.
Normal People. That's right. Unsurprisingly, I couldn't remember Normal People. And she doesn't use punctuation marks, and she doesn't use speech marks, for example, for people in her books. Does that matter, Patrick?
Well, I mean, what I have noticed in the past sort of 10, 15 years, you have companies that deliberately don't capitalise their name or bits of their name,
yes,
which is just to get noticed.
Yes.
And this is very similar
Their logos,
to the principle that Jess is talking about, the rebellion sort of thing. You will notice it. You might even notice it because you're like me and you get annoyed by it, but you'll remember it.
Yeah, indeed.
Now, with that said, I think it's one of those things where, look, there is a discipline here. We're talking about discipline. The technical term in linguistics would be register. Okay, so register is like the style level of how you're communicating, because this is well understood. The question is, as long as it needs to be the case that people have enough awareness to know which register to use in what situation. I haven't seen a great deal of evidence.
Do people have that awareness, Sophia? Do people know the right times to use how they would communicate with friends and how they would communicate with an employer or a professional contact?
That's what I worry about. And I think Jess made a good point. People still in school are being taught capital letters and good punctuation. But I question whether that is actually happening. There's been conversations where people have been saying, no, correct grammar is racist or it's inherently oppressive. So I do think there is a bit of a slippery slope where it becomes a colloquial understanding and then it moves into our education system, and then we lose it completely.
Well, thank you very much. Sorry, we just run out of time, but thank you to everybody there, to Jess, to Patrick, and indeed to Sophia. And